Good morning, everyone. Before you start, don't forget to follow us in our social networks, Instagram, LinkedIn, as the Minister of Finance and Public Credit. We will be discussing the fiscal framework in the medium term for 2021. The Minister of Finance and Public Credit, Dr. Jose Manuel Restrepo, together with the technical minister, the Director of National Public Budget, the Director of Public Credit, Cesar Arias, and the Director of Macroeconomic Policy, Juan Sebastián Betancourt. They will be explaining the scenario for the fiscal and economic policy of the next few years. Before we start, we would like to show you a brief video to emphasize the importance of the medium-term fiscal framework. This document is the roadmap of the country's fiscal policy, defining the outlook on the behavior of the most important businesses. Currently or annually, the government presents the country and the Congress the outlook about what is expected for the next 10 years in terms of economic behavior in the country. Why is this so important? The fiscal framework establishes the roadmap for the fiscal policy and presents the necessary measures and the main macroeconomic variables like economic growth, oil prices, exchange rates, fiscal aggregates, and it's divided into 4 chapters. The balance and outlook for 2021, strengthening of fiscal statistics, tax expending, and the impact of the pandemic in the entrepreneurial and business fabric, the national government policy to mitigate any impacts of the pandemic on employment. It's coordinated by the Directorate of Macroeconomic Policies. With this fiscal framework, we promote transparency and credibility of public finances. Well, after this very quick explanation of what's the medium-term fiscal framework, I would like to give the floor to the Minister of Finance, Jose Manuel Restrepo, to make his presentation. You have the floor, Minister. Thank you, Juan Sebastián. Special greetings to the Deputy Ministers, the Director of Public Credit, the Director of National Budget, the Director of Macroeconomic Policy, and all the finance team that has been working in the medium-term fiscal framework. Special greetings to all our guests, our experts, investors, representative stakeholders of national and international markets, and greetings to all the Colombian citizens who are here with us in this meeting, which is an example of how we build a transparent policy, a policy in which we openly share this roadmap, the roadmap of revenues, expenditure, and public investment, as well as the debt of the country with a 10-year forecast. This scenario we are going to share with you is being done within a very particular context, the context of a country that is still experiencing the impact of the pandemic, which has the wounds, the injuries, the scars of the impact of the pandemic, something which is not just the case in Colombia. It's an economic problem around the world. We all know the deep impact caused by COVID-19 in employment, poverty, and inequality. But today we also share with you the impact that the counter-cyclic measures had from the fiscal point of view to attenuate the economic impact of the pandemic. So during my presentation, I will be discussing the balance for 2020 and talk about the outlook for 2021 and the years to come. Acknowledging, of course, that COVID-19 has been the greatest, the most difficult, the most complex economic shock in the modern history of our country. For instance, a drop in GDP of 6.8% in 2020, or an unemployment rate of 16%, or almost 4 million people that came into poverty, but also acknowledging that these apocalyptic scenarios that some people expected never occurred. Estimates which were expected for the Colombian case of drops in the GDP close to 8%. In fact, the IMF has internationally said that the impact of the pandemic could have been threefold as a result of the fact that no actions were taken. However, countries took actions, and we had a very rapid response by the government to mitigate those impacts. Those mitigation measures of the Colombian government represented 11% of the GDP inside and outside the budget to take care of health needs, the vulnerable population, and to protect employment and jobs in the country. But this happened around the world, not just in Colombia, with a contraction of 3.5% worldwide, a reduction in the euro area of 6.5%, 7% in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this, of course, reduced private consumption in the world and the gross capital formation. But there are three aspects in Colombia that determined our figures. On the one hand, the closure of economic sectors, which determined the GDP drop. Only in April 2020, the closure of the different economic sectors was 30%. And with this, the drop in GDP in that month in Colombia was 20.8%. Secondly, the drop in the growth of our business partners, which affected our external demand. A drop of the external or foreign demand of 21%, particularly because of a lower demand and drop in the prices of commodities. And thirdly, the drop in oil prices, the reference for the Colombian case, which determined a lower value of the external demand. All of these, despite positive aspects such as an increased demand for food by the end of 2020. These three factors, closing of the economic activity, lower external demand, and the drop in international oil prices, account for the contraction of GDP in our country, which was large but moderate as compared to other countries. So our contraction was below that of Latin America, which was 7%, or Peru, which was 11.1%, or Argentina and Mexico, which were 10 and 8.5% respectively. And all of the above was due to a rapid reaction of the government through different instruments, counter-cyclical instruments, tax reduction, exemptions, fiscal arrangements, credit guarantees, direct lines of credit, or rediscount with subsidies, healthcare support programs and programs for the most vulnerable, transfer to local governments, among many other things. And also measures such as extended terms of credit for households without affecting their credit ratings, or policies to improve liquidity and guarantee the stability of the payment systems by the central bank, or the measures in terms of banking rates, which are around 1.75% nowadays. And I want to emphasize one particular effort, the effort of the Emergency Mitigation Fund, which we called FOME, a fund of about 40 billion pesos, which has had four objectives. Number one, to strengthen the healthcare system. And this includes vaccination plans. This includes follow-up programs, strengthening of the testing system, and resources for human talent in the health sector, and the most representative sectors of the healthcare sector that required assistance amongst this pandemic. I also want to stress our support to the more vulnerable households through new programs, social programs such as Solidarity revenue programs that reach 3 million families in our country with this solidarity income programs such as Families in Action, Youth in Action, Elderly, reaching over 20 million Colombians. Likewise, the support to preserve jobs and employment with novel programs such as payroll subsidies or premium subsidies, programs that were complementary with support to the business sector, such as capitalization of our financial entities, for instance, the National Guarantee Fund, which in the latter case offered guaranteed credits for almost 25 billion pesos. This policy response and the impact of this policy and the impact of the pandemic led to an avoidable deterioration of our fiscal balance. We cannot forget that in 2019, we accomplished some of the best results in terms of fiscal deficit in the recent history of our country. We cannot forget that after almost 7 years, we had a primary fiscal superavit or surplus in 2019 with an excellent performance of the economy in the months of January and February in 2020, and then the pandemic struck. The pandemic multiplied the fiscal deficit to mitigate the impact of the pandemic of about 2.5% in 2019 to 7.8%. And this is a result of three facts. On the one hand, the impact of a pandemic that evidently generates lower tax collections. On the other hand, because of the typical needs of the emergency, the economic emergency. And thirdly, because of indirect pressures that also affected our public finances. The GDP drop, the impact on investment, as well as impacts on other sectors of the economy, including pensions. This deterioration in our fiscal behavior led to an increase of public debt. For 2019, we had been able to stabilize public debt vis-a-vis the GDP, and we were able to control it in about 50.3%. And the pandemic arrived. We had to allocate resources to the pandemic. There was a drop in revenues, and the public debt experienced 64.7% in 2020. This is not very different from the international situation. The IMF estimates that the gross debt of the world reached 97.3%, with greater increases even in the developed countries, those that had more fiscal margin, only almost 19 percentage points in the United States, 18 for the United Kingdom, 11 points for some of the other countries such as Brazil, 21 in the case of Italy. So another story would have been the case if the state policies had not been adopted, because the cost of this fiscal impact also affects society. This is just to show that without efforts such as, for instance, the capitalization and guaranteed credits of the National Guarantee Fund, we would have an even greater drop and not growth as we had in microcredit. In the area of annual growth of disbursements, without the measurements adopted by the government, we would have experienced a drop in the growth of those disbursements with a deep impact on the productive sectors, much more profound than the results we had from the pandemic. In the end, we experienced positive growth. And these about 25 billion pesos have enabled around 700,000 small and medium companies, almost 1/3 of the business fabric of the country, had access to liquidity. If we didn't do that, we would have experienced serious cash flows problems in the productive sectors. Likewise, social programs were essential to attenuate the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable. These productive impacts always affect more the poorer people of society. And this has to be taken into account to design counter-cyclical measures such as the one we developed. Without these social programs, the impact would have been stronger. As you can see here, the lower quintiles were the sectors most affected in terms of the per capita income and labor income. The higher quintiles that have higher revenues were the less affected as a result of the impact of the pandemic. Therefore, without the intervention, and you can see the intervention here in green, you can see, for instance, which was the impact of institutional support for quintile number 1. The drop of per capita income was 24.6%, but there was a mitigation of almost 12%. It would have been 50% more impact on the destruction of the real per capita income in the poorest quintiles of our population. Just in terms of poverty, the additional transfers by the government and the new transfers avoided at least 3.6 percentage points of further increase in monetary poverty and prevented a higher increase in extreme poverty. In other words, without the mitigation measures, the social measures adopted by the national government, extreme poverty would have grown 50% more than what we had before the pandemic. And finally, a lot of headway has been made as a result of a program such as subsidy to the payroll or support to the formal employment in a framework of a job or employment strategy. And the results are very clear. In the worst time of the pandemic, 5.3 million jobs were lost, and now the difference is 1.4 million. This means a recovery of about 4 million jobs recovered in our country. In the formal employment support program protected 4 million jobs and shows better behavior in the occupation Colombia as compared to the rest of the countries in the region, with a less concerning impact in the peak of the pandemic in 2020 in terms of losses or drops in the occupation rate. I can say that Colombia has an economy, as we saw in the first quarter of 2021, with elements that make it more resilient, structurally speaking. A proof of that is the number of years of recession between 20 and 2020, including what we experienced last year, the year of the pandemic, as compared to other economies in the region. Amidst these circumstances, and as an additional proof of that resilience, Colombia also attracted enough foreign capital. Only Peru, as you can see, Brazil and Colombia in the region showed net capital revenues in the year 2020. And I must say that number one is Colombia, which was the country that had more foreign investment in the region as compared to other Latin American countries. This shows that in a year of pandemic such as 2020, we have a huge capacity to attract foreign investment even under a condition of recession. It is also important to say that Colombia improved its current account deficit from the negative 4.5% we had down to 3.4%. And this can be accounted for by less deficit in the factorial revenues because of direct foreign investment in the country, and also because of the drop of international oil prices and the depreciation of the peso, of our currency. And finally, as an expression of this resilience, we have the financial sector. Despite everything, the financial sector showed good indicators over the 2020. I am referring to the quality of the portfolio, but I could say the same thing in terms of solvency of the credit institutions. Never in the situation we experienced in 1999, when we had another critical moment in the economic history of our country. And it was key to react like we did in this time, the reaction of the financial superintendency with the support program to debtors, which I think allowed us to materialize a lower impact from the financial perspective than what we experienced as a result of the pandemic. And all of this is the starting point for this medium-term fiscal framework of 2021 and from there on. Because today, Colombia, as a result of what I just showed you, requires 3 types of actions to face challenges, a triad of solutions. This fiscal framework must be seen in a triple dimension. It must acknowledge that we have to work in 3 areas simultaneously. Aspect, in the economic aspect and reactivation, and in the fiscal area. These challenges would represent from now on the key purpose of our most important actions from the finance and public credit sector. 3 solutions, 3 challenges that must be conceived totally interrelated and must be comprised in this fiscal framework. First of all, the social challenge, which involves reducing the levels of poverty and extreme poverty to recover our path in the area of reduction of poverty, at least to go back to the numbers and the figures we had in 2019. Secondly, the challenge of job and employment recovery, the challenge before us to recover what we lost in the development of our gross national product. And thirdly, the fiscal challenge, which means to work for the sustainability of our public finances. This is the triad of challenges facing us, of issues that we have to work on within this medium-term fiscal framework. And these 3 challenges are mutually necessary and are interconnected. If we address the social challenge, we will generate more jobs. If we are able to address that social challenge, this will be harmonious with fiscal stability. In other words, we need a stable fiscal reality which is consistent with this social challenge. If we face the challenge of growth, we must be able to get a contribution to social stability. We will see a strengthened middle class that contributes to growth. But if we are able to generate growth, fiscally, our public finances will be stronger and we will maintain macroeconomic stability with low risk. And we also have the challenge of public finances, this fiscal challenge, a fiscal challenge which is needed for our economic recovery. So to guarantee the sustainability of public finances is the starting point, is an absolute requirement for the recovery of our economy and also for social stability. Because if we have solid, sustainable, stable public finances, we will provide the necessary resources to accomplish the social stability of our country. Hence, we have defined that the fiscal strategy of Colombia for this medium-term fiscal framework can be defined in at least 3 paths. The first one is a fiscal strategy that will be expansionist in the short term. The fiscal challenge forces us to have a short-term expansion. The challenge of economic reactivation forces us to expand in the short term. These 2 accomplishments will allow us to further stabilize public finances. This short-term approach particularly will be addressed to help the most vulnerable through the pandemic. And this We should not be indifferent to so many people that are experiencing the blows of the pandemic. This must contribute to social stability. We must become aware of the suffering of so many people as a result of the pandemic. But the fiscal strategy also involves a very strong fiscal anchor, a fiscal anchor which is solid in the medium term, to make a commitment in terms of our public debt, objectives that allow us to gradually recover the path of our fiscal reality. And thirdly, this fiscal strategy involves policy measures adopted in 2021 to raise our revenues. It involves advancing as a nation, not just as a national government, hand in hand with the Congress of the Republic, building consensus at the national level with different social stakeholders, with youth, with the representative sectors of public finances, a law of social investment. A law of social investment that guarantees the stability of medium and long-term resources, which also conveys a message of that fiscal anchor in the medium term. This is the fiscal strategy we have outlined in this framework. It will be a fiscal policy prioritizing the reactivation of the economy and protecting the most vulnerable. Specifically in the year 2021, we looked for an expansionist policy, a policy that reactivates the economy, that contributes to the growth of our economy, and protects the most vulnerable in our society.
Let's then start with our expectations, what we have foreseen in terms of growth for the year 2021. I believe the year 2021 will be a year that we will remember as a Colombia that will be one of the countries that grow the most, talking about emerging economies, even compared to OECD countries. And to that end, we collect the good behavior that we had during the first quarter of this 2021. For no one is it a secret that the first quarter of 2021 shows one of the behaviors that exceeded all expectations from different actors. It exceeded the expectations of the government even. It exceeded expectations of economic analysts in terms of growth. And yes, we had a growth rate that exceeded 1%, a growth rate that was supported on a good behavior of the manufacturing industry with a 7% growth. A very good behavior also in the agrarian sector that grew in 3.3%, public administration with countercyclical measures growing at 3.5%. A year or a quarter in which we had a growth that in any case was important and is important to highlight as being important. Then came the social expressions through the demonstrations, and in particular blockages of roads and vandalic behaviors against public infrastructure and private infrastructure. And today even with the good news that we heard on this topic, we can highlight that for this year, 2021, in considering a possible impact on account of the road closures and road blockages that occurred during the months of April and May, and the official scenario of the Ministry of Finance, with which we're announcing the growth outlook for the year 2021, is that such official growth scenario projected for Colombia be of 6% in the year 2021. And allow me to highlight this information, because this will mean going from the expectation that we had from 5% to an outlook that today is declared at 6% growth of the GDP in Colombia for this 2021. Our first estimates and preliminary estimates even indicate that being more optimistic, we could even grow above this 6%, as you can see reflected in this slide. And this, despite the fact that we believe that a possible impact as a result of all these vandalic acts and road blockages in the second quarter of 2021. And this result, this projected growth of Colombia at a 6% growth for the year 2021 is going to accelerate the reduction in unemployment and the unemployment rate, and it will contribute to a recovery of income and reduction of poverty in our country. All this on the basis of this expansive fiscal policy. That's why that first strategic point of the medium-term fiscal framework for 2021 is so important. An expansive fiscal policy having as one of its most important focuses, and I want to insist here, is employment. The priority of this fiscal policy will be very much focused on generating employment, especially employment for the youth in 2021. Then the key players of the 6% growth will be trade and hotels, the hotel sector with a 12% increase, in the manufacturing industry with a yearly growth of 10.6%, ratified today with some of the figures of the behavior of the manufacturing industry. Construction would grow at 11.1%. And this year also, we will continue receiving foreign direct investment, and we will continue doing so to finance the foreign deficit will be minus 3.8%, meaning that we will increase from 3.4 to 3.8%. And all this will be supported on a series of things. One, on the growth of our exports in this 2021, and the figures, that's what the figures indicate, a better performance of our economic partners and commercial partners and better results in terms of exchange. And this will also be supported on a 32% increase in foreign direct investment, which amongst other things will finance 3/4 of the 2021 deficit. And in line with what I just mentioned, and with the implementation of an expansionist fiscal policy in the short term, emphasizing reactivation and emphasizing the social purpose, Colombia projects for this 2021 that its fiscal deficit be of 8.6%. And this means that regarding the financial plan of 2021 that was presented last March, we will maintain the fiscal balance. That is, we will maintain the fiscal deficit at 8.6%. And this happens considering even social needs that are included in the bill that we will submit to Congress, the bill of social investment agreed upon in June, by considering a better economic performance, by considering additional income included in that bill, considering optimization and recompositioning processes of the fiscal expenditure, meaning that even despite even some of the fiscal expenditure components included in the bill, but considering the good behavior of Colombia in economic matters, additional income that the bill of law of social investment and optimization processes and recomposition of fiscal expenditure, Colombia will maintain in 2021 the commitment that it historically had in its previous financial program of a fiscal deficit of 8.6%. Thus, in 2021, we expect with this expansionist policy of social protection and reactivation, we want to continue expanding the emergency social expenditure with the Emergency Mitigation Fund, providing for sanitary situations, protecting the employment situation, and supporting increases in investment of almost 0.7% percentage points of the GDP, focus mainly in sectors that are very important for the construction of employment, such as transportation and housing sectors, infrastructure sectors, which means roads, public utilities, and housing, more amongst others that have been the commitment for Colombia, our strategy for economic reactivation. Evidently, these efforts translate into financing needs. Financing needs, together with the Direction of Public Credit and the Office of Microeconomic Policy and Budget, we have identified in 134 billion pesos, that is 12.1% of our GDP. How would we then finance 134 trillion Colombian pesos? We will do this with 21 billion in debt, 36 of which foreign, 55 of those internal or domestic, and we will do it with other resources and almost 10 billion, and also considering our initial availability of resources. These resources will allow to finance, first of all, the deficit I already mentioned. It's a deficit of 8.6%, the same deficit that had been projected previously for the year 2021 of approximately 95.7 billion Colombian pesos, of which almost 37 are billionaire interest. These resources will also finance amortization of our public agenda with 18.9% billion pesos, and other operations as well, of around 8.6 billion Colombian pesos. But even if the deficit grows in 2021 compared to 2020, as well as amortizations, the financing needs do grow less than proportionally, precisely because of efforts that we have been undertaken hand in hand with the public credit of the Ministry of Finance to pre-finance debt that we did in 2020 at reasonable rates. With this, the public debt will reach 65.1% in the year 2021. If that is 2021, what is our outlook? How do we see the year 2022? 2022 is the year in which, having achieved the progress made in vaccinations, what we have called collective immunity, that should happen in this 2021, and that is moving forward quite well in terms of the number of people vaccinated. This collective immunity will allow completely lifting the mobilization restrictions, restrictions of productive sectors, so as to be able to go back in production to pre-pandemic levels. This 2022 will also be a very important year, because next year, 2022, will be the year in which we will be able to start the fiscal adjustment process. That process is necessary to maintain public finances, to be able to make a gradual transition, an orderly transition of our country's finances. 2022 will then be a key year for reactivation and key for fiscal adjustment. And 2022, we will maintain an expansionist policy, a policy that motivates the economy and its recovery in a lesser proportion compared to 2021, of course, but also to strengthen our country's social and economic fabric. In 2022, a key role will be played by the Bill of Law of Social Investment that, as I already mentioned, will be presented to Congress in the month of June. 2022 will also be a year in which we will have an increase, a modest but growing increase, and we will continue having foreign financial investment for us. That allows us to say that in 2022, the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit, the national government, expect a growth rate of our GDP for that year of 4.3%, where it will be fundamental, where the impact of the collective immunity will be fundamental, the one reached, as well as the own economic reactivation figure, a figure that will exceed that of similar economies in Latin America. How do we support this economic growth rate of our country? Well, it is supported mainly on a capital gross investment, that is public investment and private investment. And this can be evidenced in what was announced by the president in July 2020 when he mentioned this economic reactivation program called Commitment for Colombia. That Commitment for Colombia, with investments exceeding 155 trillion Colombian pesos. Therein lie part of the efforts that the country will do both from the public as well as from the private perspective to contribute to this value of economic growth in the year 2022. Also contribute pro-investment measures that have been implemented, such as the VAT discount in capital goods to motivate productivity, entrepreneurial development of our most important sectors of the economy generating income. This growth is also supported on a good performance of household consumption, just like on a very important behavior of the exports of our country. And this will allow an important achievement, which is closing with an unemployment rate of in 2022 of close to 11.9%, an unemployment rate even higher than that of 2019, but 4 percentage points below what we had in the year 2020. And as was already mentioned, foreign direct investment will also play a key role in terms of financial financing. Almost 86% of our current account deficit will be financed with foreign direct investment, with a correction of 0.3 percentage points to the current account deficit because of a better behavior of our exports, which I believe is one of the commitments that we as a country have. 2022 and the financial plan will also be a year in which we gradually start reducing the expansionist policy. I already said it's the year where we start adjustments in fiscal adjustment matters in our country, when we start fiscal consolidation. A key part of the strategy, without any doubt, is the bill of law of social investment, which not only considers temporary but permanent sources at a larger proportion in what terms of what that bill will collect in social investment. With this, that objective, the fiscal deficit will be one of 7% of the GDP. 1.7 percentage points less than what we had in the year 2021. Amongst other things, this is consistent with estimates of deficit reductions in similar countries. The IMF and other international actors have made estimates of the corrections that countries will have in fiscal matters this year. And on average, they're similar to the proposal that Colombia is making today in this launching of the medium-term fiscal framework. How is this fiscal deficit achieved? Well, in different ways. First of all, it will be achieved through an expenditure reduction, functioning expenditure, lesser expenditure of investment that had a historic record in the year 2021. Also, with the reduction in expenditures associated to social investment project that we had for the year 2021 and now for the year 2022. Also, with a partial reduction of the emergency mitigation fund, also with an increase in tax income derived of an active strategy of fighting against evasion and continuing modernizing the fiscal authority progress in oil matters, given the good behavior of oil that we've had throughout this year. And there also an effort in optimizing assets in 0.3 percentage points of our GDP. Efforts that are headed towards improving the assets that our country has. Thus, starting from a preliminary deficit in 2021 of 5.3%, the reasons that lead to the fiscal adjustment to minus 3.5% in 2022 include, on the one hand, larger oil income, other improved efficiency levels of the tax authority, the income related from the bill of social investment, lower expenditures, fiscal expenditure, less investment expenditures, and less expense functioning expenditures in our country. And with this fiscal reality of income and expenditure, our estimate is that the financing needs for this year will be less than this year, 129 million pesos, and proportionally lower with relation to the GDP, 10.7% compared to the previous year, that is 2021, will be of 12%, and they will be financed as follows: 102 billion with the debt levels, of which domestic will be close to 62.8 billion, and the external, the remaining other resources and the initial availability with which we would close 2021. What do these accounts seek to finance? On the one part, the deficit, 7%, almost 84 billion trillion Colombian pesos, and secondly, amortizations close to 28 trillion Colombian pesos, and finally, other operations. This means then that by the end of 2022, the behavior of public debt will be of 67% of the GDP. With this in mind, if this is the reality of 2021 and the reality of 2022, based on that, or as of there, we will be able to derive what is the medium-term fiscal framework which continues from 2023 onward. It is important to mention that in that term, the country will grow above its potential. And this is very important to highlight. Colombia will grow above its growth potential, and it will do so based, first of all, on the economic reactivation plan called Commitment for Colombia and also its impact. But secondly, on account of effects of migration of labor. In this task, that commitment of the Venezuelan migration statute that was designed in our country as a state policy is one of the instruments that will allow having a positive impact on the medium-term fiscal strategy in terms of economic growth. The Colombian economy will also grow above its potential based on the behavior of private consumption. And that growth will, on the one part, achieve what our first challenge was, which was stability in the social reality, stability in economic growth, and stability in fiscal matters. The medium-term strategy foresees a current account deficit of 3%, less than the one that we currently have financed by foreign direct investment flows, and with a better behavior explained by better dynamics of non-traditional exports, as well as investment trust and investment. What do we foresee from a fiscal standpoint? We believe that we will achieve that gradual and orderly adjustment until stabilizing our public debt and reducing it with the new permanent income sources. Let's remember that the Bill of Law of Social Investment considers permanent income sources, and with this we intend to have a gradual adjustment and stabilizing the public debt. We will also have something very important, and that is that amidst this framework of social investment policy, the core of the project is a new fiscal anchor with a proposal of fiscal rule that will have as a novelty goals on the medium-term goal of our country. And here I want to be very clear. Colombia commits for the first time to establishing goals on its medium-term debt. This is included in the Bill of Law of Social investment. An anchor in debt is established, and we also strengthen the Fiscal Rule Committee. We give it a larger independence, and we also give it strength from a technical and operational standpoint. For us, this is absolutely key in this medium-term fiscal strategy. Having said this, we expect that this GDP growth road with an average growth between 2021 and 2032 of 3.7%. 3.7%. And shall be stabilizing the growth of the Colombian economy at 3.2% in the year 2031. This is slightly larger than the 3%, and it is slightly larger than the growth of that 3% because of two main reasons. The first, because it considers the accumulation of human capital, the efforts that have been done and that are even included in the social investment bill. They intend to give free access to the most vulnerable population to free higher education. That has an effect on our human capital, but this is also associated to production improvement. So the effort undertaken by different sectors and the National Planning Department as part of the compass of productivity that Colombia is capable of producing more and better. And it has multiplying important growth effects derived from the dynamic of sectors such as the industry, the construction sector, and the trade sector. There are multiplying efforts of the progress made in instruments such as the fresh novice in the housing sector, of significant progress that the world acknowledges some of the most important ones at an international level, such as the public-private partnerships in infrastructure matters. Significant progress made also with the strategy conclude the construction of airports, our fluvial network, railroads, and also the tertiary road networks that will progress and move forward in the year and a half ahead. This is also derived of a multiplying effect of productivity increases to a large extent as a result of the digital transformation in a country that is led by the ministry ICT, with the creation of over 100 or the training over 100,000 programmers, and also an increase in human capital access to higher education efforts and undertaken by SENA in our country, and programs such as the program Generation G that has been ongoing for a number of years now. Equally, the statute for protection of migrants will be the source of increased productivity, amongst other things, because on average, individuals who are arriving in our country have on average higher education levels. We expect then a migration population stabilizing around 2.7 and 2.9 million people. Equally, these efforts and this progress in matters of growth of our economy are derived from the efforts of taking advantage of markets, in particular the work undertaken by the national government in commercial and sanitary diplomacy, opening up markets to national products, diversification of exports through public procurement, through services based on knowledge, through new micro, small, and medium entrepreneurs that will have a larger export capacity, and also through the implementation of the internationalization mission that will support a gradual reduction of external deficit by increasing non-traditional exports that will increase their share. And allow me to highlight this. We are foreseeing an yearly average growth in terms of taking advantage of international markets of 4.9%. All of what I just mentioned shall lead to an increase in income with regards to the GDP. And by increasing from 16.2% to 17% as a result, first of all, of the Bill of Law of Social Investment that foresees, as I mentioned, new permanent income, that also foresees efforts in modernization of DIAN and the struggle, the fight against tax evasion, and the surplus of the central bank and a better performance of Ecopetrol. Tax income. There will be higher tax income of social investment, as well as the modernization of DIAN and the struggle and fight against fiscal evasion. And on the side of expenditure, we have a reduction ahead by reducing the value of 23.2% to 19.6% of the GDP. This on account of reduction of expenditures of the social investment bill, adjustments in public investment, and expenditures also in interest rates. Added to this are the reduction of functioning expenditures and pressures on expenditure. And this, of course, will mean legislative measures that shall be adopted in due time. The above will allow that the central national government achieves a primary balance of 0.8% of the GDP. You're seeing there how, in terms of the primary balance of our country, the ratio between income and expenditures without including interest, Colombia will go back to a surplus primary balance. And with this, a reduction in public debt of 67% in 2022 to 61.1% in 2032. Achieving the commitment that we have of materializing the adjustment in the fiscal aspect and the stability in our behavior of our public debt. In any case, it is important to mention that later on maybe an additional fiscal adjustment will be required of at least 1/3 than the one proposed by the project of social investment. We are taking a leap forward of 2/3 in terms of needs of resources in the medium and long term in the country, stabilizing the behavior and reducing the behavior of the public debt, and achieving the adequate behavior in terms of the adjustment required in the fiscal deficit, and it will be allowed to comply with what is included in a fiscal rule.
In summary, dear friends and guests, 2020 was a year in which we experienced the most difficult and the largest in proportion economic and social shock, which caused deep wounds and scars. A shock which also involved a policy response and the resilience of the Colombian economy to mitigate the impact of that shock. That shock left a triad of challenges, of solutions required in the social area, in the economic recovery area, and in the area of fiscal stability. The impact of our public policy response, the scope of that response, which led us to a reduction of growth, but far below what was originally expected for a country such as Colombia. And that left us social challenges, fiscal stability challenges, and reactivation. Therefore, in 2021, the fiscal strategy focuses on protecting the most vulnerable, encouraging proactive actions for economic reactivation, and understanding that a safe reactivation must come hand in hand with protecting the most vulnerable and our social commitment. In 2022, we will be starting an orderly and gradual fiscal adjustments, reaching primary surpluses which are enough to reduce our net debt down to 61% of our GDP. And in the medium term, we will have a more robust fiscal anchor supported by the strengthening of our permanent revenues as suggested in the social investment law. So this fiscal and growth strategy will certainly contribute to our stability, the social stability, which is indispensable for growth, to economic stability with reactivation, and fiscal stability. The social stability, the fiscal stability, and the stability of growth of the Colombian economy are the essence, the core of this medium-term fiscal framework for 2021 for the coming 10 years. So with this, I have summarized a document that I will certainly share with all of you It's a document which comprises about 340 pages, and it summarizes or presents in detail each one of the items I discussed today. We will have a presentation from the Director of Public Credit today to complement this presentation. He will further elaborate on the financing strategy of Colombia for 2021 and also for 2022. In terms of the different paths we have paved in terms of international and national debt. So I would like to give the floor, first of all, to the team of experts who are here with us participating at this meeting. And then I would like to open the opportunity for citizens, because Fiscal Framework belongs to citizens. And the document that you will be able to review, that will be published in our webpage, is a document that every citizen may access. And from there on, we will have the opportunity as well for the media who are here with us in this session of the medium-term fiscal framework, which, as I said initially, is a formal response to a legal obligation we have in the national government. But before that legal obligation is our commitment to transparency in our public finances and the growth of the Colombian economy. We can't hear you. I think we have some connectivity issues. I'm sorry, no sound. Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you very much. Recently, we have experienced a significant increase in the price of some commodities, and in particular, oil. I would like to understand how you are considering this increase in the future forecast of fiscal revenues. Part of that is permanent, and what's the impact you are assessing in terms of other variables, such as the exchange rate, that have an impact upon our fiscal balance for the future? Thank you. I'm sorry, the microphone is off. Well, first of all, special greetings to the director of the co-director of the Central Bank and Vice Minister. This question is consistent with other similar questions asked by many of our participants. What can I say about the behavior of oil prices? Well, there are several things to mention. After 2020, we experienced a drop in international oil prices, and the Brent reference is the reference for our country. We are fully aware that throughout this year, as you have seen through the media, the price of oil has recovered significantly. And I would like to insist on this, a very significant recovery. And this recovery has been the result of vaccination around the world, which has reactivated economies at the international level. And it's also the result of improved world demand, and in part as a result of the control of the offer by OPEC countries. Last week, the price of oil closed above $72 per barrel. And over the year, the average has been $64 per barrel. This has been the average for this year. What have we considered in the medium-term fiscal framework? And we have been very judicious to do a very appropriate estimate. This framework assumes an average of $63 per barrel. That's the assumption. And the assumption is that that value will be maintained for the year 2022. And this is being quite realistically, it may be even higher than the $63. This represents a 50% increase versus what we had in 2020. In 2020, a barrel of oil was at around $40. And certainly, as the co-director of the central bank says, is good news for the finances of our country because of several reasons, because it means more fiscal revenues, more dividends for Ecopetrol, and you know that Colombia is the majority shareholder of Ecopetrol. In 2021, the fiscal revenues due to oil activities will be around 0.1% of GDP, which is approximately 1.1 billion pesos. And these will be collected through revenue quotas that reflect, in part, the drop of prices in the 2020s. It's not a significant figure because of the drop of the oil prices in the last year. But here comes the difference. In 2021, the revenue forecast will improve by 800,000 million because of greater tax collections. But certainly, the greatest impact will not be seen this year. It will be seen in 2022 because in 2022, the oil revenues will be around 0.9% of our GDP. In other words, 10.7 billion pesos. This includes taxes and dividends. Obviously, this may have an impact on the exchange rate. We are fully aware of that. That's why we expect an appreciation this year of 30 pesos. Somebody could say, yeah, but the appreciation could be higher. Yeah, maybe, but our estimates also take into account other criteria. This is not the only reason why the exchange rate changes. The appreciation is relatively moderate because of other impacts. And one of them was the decisions of one of the risk rating agencies recently. So this estimate of an average exchange rate in 2021 of 3,637 pesos per dollar is an appropriate estimate as a result of this behavior. I believe that this answers your question mostly because of the impact on the oil price increase on the economy, fiscal revenues, and exchange rate. Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. I don't know whether you can hear me now. Yes, thank you. I apologize because I had some technical difficulties. Well, before presenting the fiscal framework, we asked questions through Instagram, asking people what did they want to know about the medium-term fiscal framework. And the first question that came up from our audience is, which is the impact of the strike on inflation? So maybe you can help us with this answer, Mr. Minister. Well, let me say something about this strike. I said it publicly, and I am going to repeat that here. And in my capacity as a board member of the central bank, I can mention some of our analysis as well. First of all, our analysis from the central bank team is that the expectations in terms of inflation are controlled. They are anchored, pegged. That doesn't mean that there are no particular situations due to the blocking of the highways and the impact that this has had on the provision of food and the shortages of some commodities. Today, we have a different news, and I think that we are in the path to recovery in terms of the impact of these on our economy. It is true, in the month of May, inflation grew by 1%. but it could have been 4 or 5 times what was expected for that month, particularly in foodstuffs because of the shortage of products. But I repeat, up to now, according to our analysis from the central bank, the expectations of prices are anchored pursuant to the goals established by the central bank. We will continue to analyze the behavior of prices from now on. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Let's move on to the second question by Dr. Cesar Tamayo, Dean of the School of Economics of TEAFIT, one of our universities. Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the minister for his presentation, and I hope he will be well very soon. For the government debt to have that behavioral stabilization or convergence, we need to strengthen institutionality around the fiscal rule. And the bill for sustainable solidarity, which was removed or withdrawn, had a little bit of that. It was a timid effort, but in particular, it has this autonomous committee of the fiscal rule, which was independent. So my question is, can we expect that some of these will be maintained in the future? Are we going to strengthen these efforts around the institutionality of the fiscal rule? Well, first of all, thank you, Cesar, for your message. I am here like millions of Colombians that have suffered the consequences of COVID, working from home and overcoming a disease which has affected us all. And let me take this opportunity to make an invitation to all Colombians to take care of themselves at this point in time and to get your vaccines, which are being administered by the government. Having said so, Mr. Tamayo, I would say that your question, first of all, is very we have here Juan Sebastian Betancourt, who is the Director of Macropolitics, who has been key to our commitment to strengthen the fiscal rule and the social investment law that we are submitting to the Congress. Certainly, the strengthening of the fiscal rule is the spinal cord of the social investment project. If you ask me about the 3 columns of that project, the first one is the social aspect, the concern about the vulnerable people, youth, women that lost their jobs, unemployed, the informal workers and peddlers. The second column is the example of the government being austere in its spending, fighting corruption, and generating revenues. And the third column is strengthening of the fiscal rule. You know very well that what we want is, first of all, to acknowledge that the fiscal rule has been a great progress for our country, but there are opportunities for improvement, of course, and it can be further strengthened. How can we strengthen it? That would be the question. And I think that this is part of our social investment program. It has to include in its goals a component of the level of debt. I have mentioned it several times today. We have to orient fiscal goals. We must guarantee a reasonable debt, which has to be consistent with our short-term goals. And this is a novelty of this bill. It's a novelty of the strengthening of the fiscal rule project. Why? I said it very openly. The fiscal strategy has 3 purposes, and one of them is fiscal anchor. And the fiscal anchor is associated to a public debt limit. A limit of debt defined to prevent an explosive behavior. We need to limit our debt for this purpose. And we need a medium-term debt objective. That's purpose number one, which is very important. The second one is also fundamental. How can we strengthen our institutions? Institutional strengthening. What does that mean? Institutional strengthening of the Fiscal Rule Council is to give them independence and give them further capabilities as a council of the fiscal rule. So we will have an autonomous committee for the fiscal rule with several purposes. Number one, to expand their functions, to be able to follow up public finances. Number two, more legal independence and being able to report to the Congress of the Republic, accountability to the Congress of the Republic, and an independent technical team. This is what gives this type of institutions operating capabilities. And finally, stepwise appointments of institutional periods to be more independent and to be proficient in the roles, and also methodological improvements, particularly for the cyclic components of the fiscal balance. So we want to facilitate replicability and avoid biases. In the end, these are three essential chapters for these pillar, for these spinal cord of the fiscal rule to contribute to the second purpose of our medium-term strategy, which is fiscal anchor. Thank you, Mr. Minister. And with this question from Instagram, we are going to close this Q&A. This comes from Sebastian Rionbajo Rory. He's asking, what's the level of public debt? That's the question. Well, I answered that question during my presentation, but I will answer again. I have to go back to the starting point context. Before the pandemic, we had accomplished the process of stability in our public debt behavior of about 50%. That was accomplished in December 2019. And then the pandemic hit. And the pandemic had a profound impact. We needed to mitigate. There were social emergencies, lots of difficulties experienced by millions of Colombians that had to be served by a very active state in terms of public finances, with the requirement of fiscal support for those vulnerable stakeholders. So in 2020, we increased 60.4% of GDP of public debt, with a fiscal deficit which was 3 times what was in 2019. 2021 is still a year that requires active fiscal intervention, and we need it because the pandemic hasn't gone away, and because reactivation is urgent, and we need it because growth is indispensable even for the stability of public finances, not just for social stability. Therefore, in 2021, it's 61.1% with that short-term expansive policy to activate investment and for social development. So after 2022, go through a process of convergence, about 60% of the GDP in terms of public debt, on the basis of that commitment to generate permanent revenues, which are part of our social investment project. And this project represents 2/3 of the adjustment required by our country. But of course, we are still missing 1/3 that will probably take place in the coming years. Well, Minister, thank you very much for answering these questions in the first cycle. Before we continue, let's take a short break, a 5-minute break, and then we will come back with our press conference. We have all the questions from the media.
Thank you very much for waiting. Thank you very much for your patience. We shall now start the press conference of the medium-term fiscal framework. We start with Marta Blanca, who asks about the effort in austerity of the of the public expenditure and to finance the social policy in the rest of the year. How many resources will be added to subsidize the payroll, which is part of the reactivation? So it's approximately 3 questions. Minister, I hand the floor to you. Well, I think there are a number of questions involved here. Allow me to tackle them in a more or less level of detail. The social investment credit has as one of its most important pillars the example of the central government. And the central government needs to show austerity in public expenditure. It needs to show example in terms of reducing costs, in terms of bureaucracy, red tape, operational costs, transfer costs, different to those that have a constitutional origin or a legal origin, of course. And we believe that by making an effort on each of these topics, I'm not going to go into the articles because we're building this based on a consensus, but the consensus is that the government must lead by example. And what we're saying is that the government can imply savings around 1.8 trillion pesos per year until reaching up to 3% of the GDP of our country in the coming years, which means that there we will have a huge effort on the part of the state in terms of austerity and public expenditure. This austerity will allow generating 20% of what I believe would be the collection of the project of social investment, which is not small. This seeks to allow our country to be able to face the stabilities of public finance, social stability, and the needs of stability in terms of economic growth as well. So I think this is the answer to that question. Thank you, Minister. This is a question by Jorge Sainz from El Espectador. Minister, good afternoon. How does the tax reform fit this medium-term fiscal framework? What does the privatization plan and how do the better oil prices help in terms of public finance? You already heard what I answered in terms of oil price, the impact that is significantly having in the year 2022 onward will have because of the normal lag in terms of the tax income. There is a lag and there is an effect in 2021 because of the withholding at source. So I think that answer was already given in my presentation. In terms of the plan of privatizations, what do we foresee? What we foresee is 14 trillion for the year 2021 and 7.1 trillion for the year 2022, which means continuing moving forward in what was already foreseen in the previous frameworks that you already know. These are public knowledge in the year 2021 and continuing working on optimization of the nation's assets, which are part of the portfolio. You know that our portfolio is approximately of 76 trillion Colombian pesos, and there we're talking about 10% thereof in some of those elements of the portfolio, even with some articles that will be included in the social investment bill or project seeking to facilitate a series of projects and processes in certain types of assets, which have always been discussed. So we're talking about around 21 trillion Colombian pesos between 2021 and 2022. Thank you very much, Minister. We're going to go to questions by Bloomberg, 4 in total. Allow me to read them. When will ISA be sold, which is already included in this year's fiscal accounts, internal debt of 2021 and 2022? How many will be auctions? And in terms of 2022, how many bonds will be issued? And the deficit of 7%, does it comply with the metrics of fiscal rule, or does it mean that the escape clause will be used again? The question of financing, I will allow Cesar to answer that, I don't know if we wait or if I pass the floor right now. But beyond that, I want to talk about the selling of ISA. The national government is currently working on materializing the resources resulting from the asset materialization proceeds as established for 2021 and for 2022. As a general principle of action, we are in line with the schedules established for that purpose, and we will continue meeting them through the direction of participation of the Ministry of Finance. So we're in line with that direction. I cannot anticipate one value or the other because in the end this will depend on a series of circumstances, 1,000, but we are complying with the schedule established in that resources derived from. I don't know, Cesar, if you would like to answer the question regarding the financing of bonds. Yes, Minister, thank you very much. Regarding the question of financing, I would like to divide it into two parts. So when it comes to the year 2021, there will be no changes in the amounts for auctions. We continue with the 40 trillion that were announced since the financial plan, and this becomes established in fixed trace auctions every 2 weeks and in UR of 350 trillion. The same way, in terms of external financing, there is a proportion very close to 50 or 55, 45% between external bonds and multilaterals. For the year 2022, we are not thinking yet, there is still a lot of time to get there. We're not thinking yet of doing material changes to the amounts of the auctions. What we are projecting is a larger diversification for issuance mechanisms. In addition to auctions, we will have syndications, we will have green bonds, public debt, public debt, which will allow us to diversify further. There is an important topic regarding fiscal rule that was included in that question, is that we need to highlight that the compliance of the rule was lifted for this year 2021, and for the year 2022, commitments will be included in the social investment project, both in public debt in a gradual increase path compared to what we had before. Thank you very much, Minister and Director Arias. Let's go to the next question sent by Carolina Salazar from La República. At how much did you establish the Brent price, exchange rate, and inflation rate for this and next year? Okay, let's first talk about inflation. Here we're talking about an inflation of 3% for the year 2021, approximately 2.8 for 2022. We're talking about a Brent price that I described in detail in a previous question, $63 per barrel, both for 2021 as well as for 2022. And in terms of the exchange rate, we're talking about 3,667 on average for 2021 and 3,634 on average for 2022. These estimates are coherent with the whole content of figures of our strategy, with the content of income of the strategy, and with the behavior of our current account balance of the country as it is foreseen. Thank you very much, Minister. Let's go to the question by Rodrigo Torres. The tax reform of former Minister Alberto Carrasquilla sought to modify the fiscal rule for 2022. Since it was not approved, the medium-term fiscal framework, does it foresee that something similar will happen in the second semester? Otherwise, it's very likely that the deficit is not in agreement with the current law. Well, precisely. That is why the social investment project, the third core, is the fiscal rule, and it includes that path that I have presented today in terms of fiscal deficit and public debt. So therefore, the fiscal rule is a substantial part of that project, and of course, it refers to what is expected for the year 2022. Thank you very much. Question by Luis Enrique Hurtado from Caracol Radio. With a 6% growth, how much can the unemployment and poverty be reduced? So will there be a reduction in public expenditure in the payroll of the state, or will you keep these contracts? We have the twofold commitment, as I said at the beginning, that austerity reduction in public expenditure goes in line with what I mentioned before, 1.8 trillion Colombian pesos per year. And regarding the behavior of the economic growth, that estimate, as I said and as I presented, has a growth goal that, in addition to the fiscal effort that is foreseen, will gradually reduce the fiscal deficit and will gradually increase the behavior of unemployment rate in our country. As I said, we will end up 4 percentage points below the unemployment rate of the year 2021 in the year 2022. So close to the figures of 2019. Thank you very much, Minister. And in poverty and in extreme poverty, the purpose of the social investment, the bill foreseen is to be able to take extreme poverty back to pre-pandemic figures that we had in the country. Thank you, Minister. Juan Sebastián Amaya from RTS Noticias, very much in line with the previous question, asks, what is the goal of employment recovered in the next year, and what will be the end figure in the year and the next year? The idea is to expect the unemployment rate to reduce 14.1% in 21 and to 11.9% in 2022. That's why I said between 2021 and 2022 there's almost 4 percentage point reductions, and it is a huge effort in reducing unemployment. Question by Daniel Guerrero from Primera Página. The question is, in the increase of disbursements in 2022 is big, especially in internal vis-a-vis 2021. How much of this will be on account of auctions? Allow me to hand the floor to Cesar Arias for him to answer this question. Thank you very much. Well, here again, there is an increase close to 7 trillion Colombian pesos in internal sources compared to sources, comparing sources of 2021 and 2022. It's very likely that the auctions, and we still have time between now and December this year to calibrate the auctions of next year, will be very close to the current levels, which today are at 700 billion for fixed rate and 350 for UVR. What is important to mention at this point is that next year we would like to diversify even further sources so as to be able to allocate these resources. And here again, in addition to traditional auctions that will be around the figures of 2021, we would like to be more active in syndication in the fund of stock exchange fund and green bonds, which we will also be launching in the second half year this year, and that will continue next year. We have another question by Freddy Gomez from CMI. The question is, in the reduction of expenditures, are you foreseeing measures on salaries in public sector and yearly increases? Well, yearly increases are constitutionally established. They have a protection and they're protected by law. So what we can do is control the bureaucratic growth that we have in the country, but we have to be very respectful of the Constitution and of the law. Well, thank you very much, Minister, and I would like to thank all the members of the economic team of the Ministry of Finance. It has been a very fruitful afternoon. Many questions were answered, and well, you will be reassured that once this event is over, this document, the complete document, the press bulletin, and the presentation by the minister will be included on our website. With this, we finish this press conference and the presentation of the medium-term fiscal framework. Thank you very much for your company. On behalf of the Ministry of Finance, all the vice ministries and the macro policy department, everyone who has participated, and there is a document with the intent of being absolutely clear in terms of debt and financing and accountability as required by Colombia for the coming years, with the commitment with the country that we have in terms of the successful implementation of the social investment project, with the firm intention of achieving social stability, stability in growth and economic reactivation, and stability in public finance. Thank you very much, Minister. We will work in favor of this triad. Thank you very much for joining this broadcast. Goodbye.